Director of Public Funds Public Schools. We want to thank everyone for joining us today for the second event in PFPS's webinar series. Public Funds Public Schools, which is a collaboration of Education Law Center, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC Action Fund, and Munger, Tolles & Olson, is dedicated to ensuring that public funds for education are used to maintain, support, and strengthen public schools. Please visit our website, pfps.org, for more information and sign up for updates on our contact page. We're very grateful to the National Education Policy Center for co-sponsoring today's webinar, and their website is nepc.colorado.edu. Today, we're delighted to host Professor Kevin Wellner and Professor Luis Huerta for a webinar entitled Education Savings Account Vouchers Explained. What are they, and what are their likely impacts on students and on public schooling? Our topic this afternoon is an important and timely one, but centered in all of our thoughts are the events of the last few weeks as people across the country protest and demand justice in the face of police violence and discrimination against Black people across the US. In fact, right now in Houston, the memorial service for George Floyd is taking place. Private school vouchers specifically and education equity work generally raise many issues of racial justice that are of deep concern to PFPS and to those who participate in and support our work. And I'm sure that our panelists will touch on some of those issues during their remarks. But before we proceed, we also want to pause to pay tribute to those who have suffered and lost their lives due to police violence, including George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and to those across the country who are engaging in an urgent and painful struggle for justice. And we'll welcome all thoughts during the question and answer period toward the end of the hour. Our speakers today will explore the past and present of Education Savings Account, or ESA vouchers, including how they evolved from conventional voucher and tuition tax credit programs and their likely impacts on students and public schooling. With US Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos now proposing that a portion of the federal COVID-19 stimulus dollars for education be used to fund private school vouchers in the form of microgrants, our speakers will also explain why it is more important than ever to understand what ESAs are and why voucher advocates are promoting ESAs during the current crisis of the COVID pandemic. Our format for this webinar will be a conversation with two experts in the field of private school vouchers, Dr. Luis Huerta and Dr. Kevin Wellner. Professor Huerta is Associate Professor of Education and Public Policy at Columbia University Teachers College. His areas of research include education privatization and school finance, and his writings on these topics have been featured in both numerous scholarly publications and popular outlets like the New York Times. Professor Kevin Wellner is a professor in the School of Education at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and he is also the director of this event's co-sponsor, the National Education Policy Center. His research includes key texts on private school vouchers, and like Professor Huerta, he writes for popular outlets also like the New York Times. I will pose some questions to each of them about ESA vouchers past and present, and after that, we'll open it up to our audience to submit questions. I ask that you please use the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, but the Q&A, to submit your questions, and I will read as many as possible to our panelists during the last 15 or so minutes of the hour. And we will also record the webinar and post it on our website for those who aren't able to join live. So without further ado, I'm going to direct the first question to Luis. Could you start us off with a very brief history of vouchers in the United States?
Yes, first of all, thank you, Jessica, and all the sponsors of the event and for the invitation to participate. And welcome to everybody who is attending the webinar today. So just a brief primer on the history of vouchers, and we'll fold this into how vouchers have evolved into tax credits and education savings accounts that we'll speak about in more detail. So voucher programs began in 1990 in Milwaukee, and thereafter have expanded to 14 states, about 26 different programs in these 14 states. Like other school choice programs, voucher programs were initially promoted on what some have identified as a sort of a strange bedfellows union, promoting both the very private individual choice consistent with our shared values of democracy, including liberty and individual empowerment, especially in education sector where many thought government was unable to meet the individual needs of families, a very seductive sell to many low-income disenfranchised communities, while at the same time promoting this idea that private school choice programs would unleash the ideals of market competition and market forces that would then promote more increased effectiveness and efficiency in all schools, public and private. Yet 30 years later, we find ourselves sorting through whether the trade-off of having accepted market ideals infused in schools has come at the expense of equity, stability, and other community values. We will talk about these issues of equity and access as we engage you this afternoon. More broadly, as I mentioned, there's 26 programs across 14 states and vouchers. All these existing voucher programs are targeted to specific student populations and use different means-tested mechanisms, including low-income status, whether students are enrolled in low-performing schools, whether they have a disability, or whether they reside in districts with no other public schools. As distinct from, and we'll get into this in more detail, tax credit programs, which we now have about 31 of these programs in 45 states, excuse me, in 20 states, and most of the existing tax credit programs evolved in the late 90s after many of the voucher programs were already online, and they have expanded significantly over the last 10 years. And similar to voucher programs, most tuition tax credit programs limit eligibility to students who meet some of the thresholds that are specific to vouchers, and have much broader eligibility criteria. However, several programs have extended subsidies to existing private school students as well, which is not common in voucher programs. And then lastly, we have about 5 states now, or 6 states that operate education savings programs. And now there's 2 important differences that exist between voucher programs and education savings accounts programs. First, most voucher programs limit subsidy expenditures to private school tuition costs and transportation, while education savings accounts allow parents to use their subsidy for a much broader range of services, including tuition costs, transportation, and also allow their or tutoring, music lessons, and other education services. And second, education savings accounts programs do not require private schools to accept vouchers in exchange for full tuition. And most importantly, when a student's education costs are lower than the subsidy amount, the balance of funds are often deposited into what is called this education savings account for students. Kevin.
Jessica, you're muted.
Jessica, you're muted.
Thank you, perils of Zoom. Kevin, following up on Luis's explanation of the history of vouchers, can you tell us a little bit more about how the conventional voucher approach that he described evolved into the education savings account approach and what the key differences are?
Sure. So I'm going to try sharing my screen. Let's see if this works. Give it a shot. Got it? Okay, so you see at the top of the screen is the conventional voucher system approach. State government has money that it takes in through taxes and other mechanisms, and issues a voucher that is issued to the parent, the family, and the parent then takes the voucher to the private or parochial school, which then takes that voucher back to the state and receives cash, which is a payment from the state. So it's a fairly straightforward system. Luis mentioned tuition tax credit systems. That really starts, it's a more complex system, as you can see. It starts with a taxpayer who owes money to the state, in other words, who owes taxes to the state. The taxpayer can decide to donate an amount, depending on the state, but an amount up to perhaps the amount that is owed to the state, and donates that to a nonprofit corporation that's created for this purpose, oftentimes something called a school tuition organization or a scholarship granting organization is what you'll hear. And then that private nonprofit corporation plays the role that we saw the state government playing with the conventional voucher system. So it takes those different donations, packages them in the form of vouchers that parents then take to the private or parochial school, which then takes that back to the nonprofit corporation, receives the payment. The role of the state government then comes in at the end in the form of a tax credit, right? So here, and the taxpayer donor who owed a certain amount of money to the state has a tax credit applied to that amount, oftentimes up to 100% or 90%, some fairly large amount, and essentially has that tax obligation forgiven. Education savings accounts look a lot like conventional voucher system approaches. But instead of a voucher being given to the parent, the state government gives essentially a debit card to the parent. The parent then can take that money not just to a private or parochial school to pay for tuition, but also for other educational expenses. So things like paying for online schooling, paying for tutoring, paying for textbooks or computers. And actually that amount can roll over from year to year, and the amount in the education savings account can increase that way. If the family still has money when the child graduates from high school, they could even use it to pay for college expenses, higher education expenses. You'll see back up here on the tuition tax credit system approach that I have the other educational expenses amount box there in dotted lines. One of the things that Betsy DeVos wanted to do when she came into office was to support something called education freedom accounts, which is an idea I think Senator Ted Cruz has mainly been the sponsor for. And that sets up a system very similar to the tuition tax credit voucher system. But at the end, instead of a voucher being given out, it gives out a debit card. So that's the idea of this federal voucher plan that you've heard floated since the outset of this administration. So I'm going to try to go back now. Let's see if I can figure out how to stop share. Okay. Currently, ESAs, as Luis mentioned, exist only in 5 states and actually only issue about 20,000 ESA vouchers. The 5 states are Arizona, Florida, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And the focus of all these programs is overwhelmingly on students with disabilities. So the means testing or the eligibility criteria that Luis talked about. In the case of ESA vouchers, it's focused very much on students with disabilities. The amount given per year to someone who receives an ESA voucher tends to be in the $6,000 to $10,000. But 2 much, much larger ESA programs have become law for short periods of time. In Arizona, which does have an ESA voucher approach, but this was a much bigger scale up of it, and in Nevada. But both of those models were unrestricted. Those were universal ESA models where anyone could be eligible. But in both cases, the laws never really went into effect. In Nevada, the law was struck down by the state Supreme Court, thanks to the efforts of Jessica and Education Law Center, among others, which the court required the legislature to fund the ESA program with monies other than those allocated through the state constitutional system to public schools. And in Arizona, the law went before the state's voters in 2018, and they soundly rejected it. I'll turn it back over to Jessica.
Great, thank you. Luis, can you talk a bit now about what makes the ESA approach attractive to voucher advocates in general and in particular in this time of the COVID pandemic?
Sure. And I just very briefly, I'm going to just emphasize one of the points with regards to scale very quickly on the previous response that Kevin and I were providing with regards to the number of students, because I think the scale issue is important that exists before I answer the question, Jessica. So it's important to remember that when we combine both voucher students, which is about 185,000 kids right now, tax credit students that are participating, which is about 271,000, and then kids participating in ESAs, that still amounts to less than 0.008% of our total student population. And I think it's important to put that in context of sort of public choice programs like charters that have grown to now serve almost 5% of the total school population. So it's my way of saying we're having a lot of conversations about these choice mechanisms, which are important, especially in issues that raise around issues of equity. But it's also important to consider that the scale still is relatively small in comparison to the reality of the vast majority of students are in more traditional school models, or not these choice models. With specific attention to the question that you just asked, I want to answer this question by focusing mostly on issues around accountability, because I think one of the main mechanisms that makes ESAs and or vouchers or tax credits right now more attractive to a more conservative majority, and specifically to some of the administration's agenda, is the fact that a lot of these types of voucher or ESA type programs, or I'll just label them in general, sort of school privatization programs, operate with an enormous amount of, or a lack of accountability. So in other words, the majority of these programs across state expressly prohibit or limit the ability of the government to administer even the most basic oversight and accountability measures in private schools, which makes them very attractive in relation to the fact that the CARES funding is being expanded now to private schools as well. So specifically, the governance, practice, and accountability standards of private schools are not uniform with public schools, including teacher accreditation requirements, accountability systems, curriculum and assessments, admissions criteria, services to students with unique needs, including special ed and English language learners, for example. And most voucher programs require special ed students, for example, who accept a voucher to give up their due process rights guaranteed under IDA. This lack of parallel and accountability and adequate funding systems threatens the ability of the state to guarantee both effective and efficient education students for all. In addition, without increased efforts to collect and disseminate information on private schools, including tuition prices, which I'll talk about more in one of my other answers, student achievement data, graduation rates, et cetera, families who choose to participate in voucher or ESA type programs are not informed of the effectiveness, quality of private schools, or the additional costs they might have to bear, given that especially education savings account and tuition tax credit programs are not accepted in lieu of full tuition. So for example, less than half of all voucher, tuition tax credit, and ESA programs require private schools to administer student achievement tests to any subsidy recipients. And those that do require are actually fairly soft requirements, because there's seldom any consequences once a test is administered and data might be collected. There are seldom any consequences if private schools are not meeting the needs of those students based on their student achievement. So when we talk about, in reference to my previous comment around sort of the market ideals, it's important to remember that a fair and open market depends on an exchange of reliable and accessible information. And without this collection and dissemination of reliable data for parents to actually make choices, a market cannot function, or if it does function, it will advantage certain families. And that's something that's important to consider, especially now as private schools have the same level of eligibility for some of the relief money that's provided under the CARES Act. And the criteria by which this money will be distributed to either public or private, or based on student needs, or based on some other, it's still not clear enough for the public to adequately assess the equity issues around some of this relief money that's being provided by the CARES Act.
Thank you very much, Luis. Kevin, along those same lines, how does U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos's proposal for what are being called micro grants funded with federal stimulus dollars for education, how does that fit in with this? Are those ESAs?
Yes, they are apparently structured as ESAs. The specifics of what any given state might propose, we don't know yet, but that to the extent that we understand what is being proposed, they do look a lot like ESAs. So what DeVos did is she used some of the CARES Act, the stimulus money, to create a competition for grants, right? Similar to the Race to the Top program, open to all state agencies to submit proposals for. So they can apply for these ESA micro grants, or actually for one of two other categories, one concerning online education and one sort of remote education, remote learning in general. And it's important to note a couple of things. First of all, the pool of money is fairly small by federal terms. It's for the entire US, it's $180 million for all those categories, including the ESA microgrants. The other thing to note is that the CARES Act funding was passed by Congress. It was this discretionary amount was supposed to be used by the Education Department for states that are most impacted by coronavirus to help meet their greatest pandemic-related educational needs. So the Department of Education took that discretion and came up with this ESA microgrant approach, apparently because, in their view, among the nation's greatest pandemic-related educational needs is the dearth of voucher policies, right? So that's sort of where this is coming from. But at this point, we don't know which states, if any, have submitted proposals to receive this grant money for ESAs. I suspect that the 5 states we mentioned earlier that already have ESA policies, so that's what, Arizona, Florida, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Tennessee, those are the ones most likely to submit under this category, but we just don't know. So yeah, I'll stop there. We'll save some time for other things. I think that answers that question.
Thank you. Luis, throwing it back to you, what do we know about academic outcomes of both conventional voucher approaches as well as newer approaches like ESAs?
So my response to this question is going to be focused mostly on some of the effectiveness or student achievement data around vouchers, because the student achievement evaluations around ESAs and tax credits are highly limited. So I'll focus mostly on sort of the voucher data, which is applicable in relation to the private choice programs or the private school selection that is consistent with tax credit programs and education savings account. So we have about 30 years of research on this issue right now. And after 30 years of research since 1990, when the voucher program started in Milwaukee, is that evidence of voucher program effectiveness remains uncertain with inconsistent effects on student achievement growth, and should be interpreted with caution. However, we are seeing a bit more work in the last 5 or 6 years that have been a bit more conclusive and so forth. I think that some of the work that Rouse and Barrow did in 2009, which actually analyzed most of the randomized control studies, was pretty conclusive in indicating that voucher studies completed prior to 2009 concluded that the best research to date finds relatively small achievement gains for students offered ed vouchers, most of which were not statistically significant. Now, a lot of the work that was reviewed in some of the meta-analysis that Rouse and Barrow engaged has then since been gone to be considered sort of the gold standard research, the research that's grounded on sort of randomized control. And this is where our voucher advocates have continued to sort of cite these so-called gold standard studies promoted by the Friedman Foundation, which is a long-standing voucher advocacy group, and EdChoice and similar organizations. But these organizations have irresponsibly failed to acknowledge any of the limitations of the very authors these studies have warned against in their research, specifically some of the studies promoted by Friedman and EdChoice organizations. So some of the work of Lubienski and Lubienski, the recent work, has sort of pointed out some of these inconsistencies. And what we know from some of these studies is that some of the studies reflect positive gains in some grades, but not across all grade levels that have received the voucher treatment. Or some studies have reflected positive impact do not include all the voucher students in a school, leaving out a significant portion of samples. Or another point that Lubienski and Lubienski make is that most positive effects are isolated in specific grade levels or a specific student characteristic, whether it's race or special ed, or a specific topic, whether it's reading and math, but do not reflect positive gains for all students across all grade levels, leaving it suspect to make any claims that there are wide-scale effects of some of these for kids who go in, positive effects for kids who go into voucher schools. In other words, the results are very haphazard and inconsistent, and some of these authors, the very authors warn that these inconsistent results should not be used to inform policy decisions. Now, the most recent data out of the DC Opportunity Scholarship, the Louisiana Scholarship Program, the program in Ohio and Indiana. These 4 programs, large programs, all 4 recent evaluations of these large programs have actually started to indicate negative effects, where there is an actually negative impact for students who participate in these programs, which are some of the most recent findings in this. So the lack of evidence or research evidence on these, or the extent of this evidence is really sort of non-uniform across, or has been non-uniform until more recently, as we begin to see a consistent sort of effect, which is negative in some of these large-scale programs that exist.
Thank you. Kevin, you both have touched on this a little bit, but could you expand more on issues of accountability or transparency? Are there issues like that that policymakers, parents, and others should consider when we're talking about ESAs?
Yeah. So as Louise said, that the lack of regulation in these policies is a feature, not a bug, right? It's we don't get to look behind the curtain for intentional reasons. We know just a bit about who receives the funding and where they spend it. Here I'm talking about ESAs. We know even less about the outcomes and experiences of those who receive the ESAs. In 3, Luis mentioned very briefly earlier that in some of the states, it turns out it's 3 of the 5 states that have ESA programs currently, the students have to take a norm reference test, not a specific one, but any one from a long list. In all 3 of the states, the eligibility is just students with disabilities. So in some cases, there are some cases where a norm reference test isn't appropriate depending on the disability, but when it is appropriate, they're expected to take a test. But the testing data aren't publicly available, and no analyses have been published to my knowledge. So then regarding how the money is spent, the Arizona Office of the Auditor General has been looking annually at that question and has found a few instances of parents using the money for non-approved purchases. So, big screen TVs, that sort of thing. The misspending of that type does now seem to have gotten somewhat under control, but the 2018 audit still found, and here I quote, nearly 900 successful transactions at unapproved merchants totaling more than $700,000. In one case noted in an earlier audit, parents went to an approved vendor, got $3,600, purchased $3,600 in approved educational materials using their ESA debit cards. But they then returned to the store and returned the items, got gift cards from the store, and then they bought non-educational items. In this case, a sock monkey, a snow globe, a World of Warcraft calendar, and a Walking Dead board game. Right, so you had these instances, and this is obviously just a snapshot. We're talking about $700,000 in a year. You're talking about a lot more examples. But the type of accountability we're supposed to trust here is really much more, as Luis was saying, a market accountability model. So you have the consumer parents who are expected to spend the money wisely because they are in the best position to know what the child needs. And the vendors, of course, are trying to supply the market with things that are useful to the parents, and they're going to advertise those goods, and they're going to compete with one another to provide the best product. So that's the idea. The sort of normal oversight that we expect over the spending of taxpayer money then gets pushed aside. And Luis also mentioned that, going back 2 other points in response to your question. One of them Luis mentioned, which is that when a parent agrees to forego public schooling education for the child in order to get the ESA grant, and here again, we're talking about students with disabilities overwhelmingly, they need to understand that part of what they're doing is they're relinquishing their rights and protections under the IDEA, under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And So that's one important point. The other is that for lower income families with few additional resources available to supplement the amount that's available through the ESA account, the choices are going to be somewhat limited, particularly once transportation issues are taken into account. The funding provided for the ESA is generally less than, somewhat close, but less than the amount that the state provides for a public school to educate that student with disabilities. And that amount, importantly, is generally less than the public school needs in order to meet the needs of the students with disabilities. So while there are private schools that do a wonderful job providing educations to students with disabilities, their cost can be 3 or more times what is provided through the ESA account. And so what this typically means is that wealthier families can truly benefit from the ESA subsidy, while non-wealthy families are likely to be trading services for choices, right? They can decide, they can make that decision about how to spend the ESA money, but the students still receive fewer resources.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And I want to remind everybody that we'll be moving to Q&A from the audience in a few minutes. And so please keep sending your wonderful questions. But I have just a couple more of my own for Luis and Kevin. So Luis, just one more for you. Can you talk about whether there are, you've talked about ESA programs of different sizes, but are there barriers to scaling up ESAs and other private school choice programs?
So I think the barriers that exist for ESA programs and scaling up and serving a wider number of students is very similar to the same barriers that exist, sometimes by design, as Kevin had mentioned, in tax credit programs and voucher programs. So and my response here is I want to focus a little bit on specifically on these issues of equity and access as they relate to the behavior of the supply side of choice, because too often we talk about the demand side of choice, specifically how choice mechanisms are supposed to promise more access for families, many of them from disenfranchised families and so forth. But seldom do we have this conversation about the behavior and the control that the supply side, the private school providers themselves, but the control that they have in limiting the number of space available and changing tuition prices, et cetera. I'll talk a little bit about that. So when we talk about whether it's vouchers, tax credits, or ESAs, we know that private schools who choose to participate and accept a public scholarship or a subsidy are not required to accept the amount in exchange for full tuition in the ESA context and in the tuition tax credit context, but not in the voucher context. So also private school tuition rates are not regulated by states, nor do states collect accurate information on private school tuition rates. So without an accurate account of actual tuition costs, parents are not informed of the additional costs they must bear. So thus scholarship amounts may result in only a partial payment for what is guaranteed by most state constitutions as a free public education, according to most state education clauses or state constitution clauses. So in that respect, the idea that private schools have the ability to change tuition prices at any point and that subsidy amounts through these programs may stay static may yield a much larger cost down the road for a lot of families who choose to exit. Let's talk about a little bit about elasticity of prices. And we need to consider that elasticity of tuition is dependent on which private schools participate and the subsidy amount and the types of students that private schools admit. So we know that because states do not regulate tuition prices, as I already mentioned, families that use the benefit to enter private schools today may not have sufficient residual income to pay for a tuition increase in the future. Some recent research measuring the effects of voucher and tax credit subsidies on private schools report that subsidies may also yield cream skimming of students who are either unwilling or unable to pay higher tuition or are screened out on basis of academic ability or performance or some other reason that private schools have the ability to utilize to get students to exit their schools. Lastly, student level tuition, student level indicators that identify the characteristics of voucher or tuition tax credits or ESA beneficiaries are insufficient to assess whether private schools are accepting the same rate of special ed students, ELL kids, or other students with special needs. These are all important factors that may impact tuition elasticity, but for which we have insufficient data as a result of limited or non-existent efforts on behalf of states to make this data more transparent to researchers and to the public. Another issue around supply side response depends more on the criteria that schools, as I indicated, use in choosing students and less on giving parents the ability to choose. So this is an issue that is whether private schools have the capacity to respond to increased demand if tuition tax credits or ESA programs or vouchers are scaled up, and whether that pent up demand for private school options exists from parents' demand side. And on that point, some of the recent research that I'm doing with regards to whether there is a pent-up demand is that we're beginning to see in a couple of states an actual decline in the take-up of some of these types of programs. So for example, I've been tracking the Florida tax credit programs, and in Florida, we used to have a voucher program, and we currently have a tax credit program, a variety of tax credit programs. But in 01 and 02, from 01 so in 01 and 02, 2001, 2002, there was about 1,900 schools that were participating in these types of programs. Then in 2013 and 2014, and this is not counting the voucher programs that are no longer in existence in Florida, we had about 2,300 schools. Now, the interesting part about this number is that we've seen an increase in the number of schools that have accepted kids, but we've actually seen about a 10% decrease in the number of kids who are participating in these types of programs. This is research that I'm doing. This is very hard information to collect because of the lack of data collection on behalf of some states. But back to this issue of supply side and demand. So the supply and demand issues raise these sort of larger questions of also the size of benefit that is actually needed to elicit a response from private schools to increase spaces available. Some of the research that I've done, accessing some of the information from the United States Catholic or Conference of Catholic Bishops, who are the largest shareholders of private schools in the United States, and who have been very active in lobbying for tuition subsidies of different types, vouchers and ESAs, is that they indicate that a much larger subsidy would be needed to actually increase space. Adjusted for today's dollars, the subsidy amount would have to be upwards of $16,000 per kid, which no voucher other than some of the special ed voucher comes even close to providing. So private schools also recognize that quality and fidelity to their mission is heavily influenced by school size and the makeup of the student body. So that private schools may not want to scale up, even if an adequate subsidy amount were even provided. Last piece here, and this speaks to important supply side behavior that school choice advocates often choose to overlook, and that is that the expansion of private school choice is more dependent on the criteria that schools use in choosing parents and less dependent on giving parents the ability to choose schools. And I think that that point has to be at the forefront of any of these debates around issues of equity and access as it relates to whether it's vouchers, tax credits, or ESA programs.
Thank you very much. And Kevin, going back to you for one more question before our audience questions, and I'll just tell our audience that you are also an attorney, because this question is about law and policy. How do law and policy intersect around ESAs and other unconventional approaches to vouchers? And do you think the shift from conventional vouchers to these neo-vouchers and ESAs that we've been talking about is driven by policy, by law, or by both?
I think the shift is driven by both. Initially, the shift away from conventional vouchers and toward vouchers funded through tax-credited donations had an enormous legal upside for the voucher advocates. Very briefly, this shift allowed the voucher advocates to argue that the policies didn't violate provisions in state constitutions called no-aid clauses. that prohibited the state spending to support churches and religious institutions. The trick behind this was that the state was only providing a tax credit. Go back to that figure that I provided early on. So the state is only providing a tax credit, so the dollars supporting the religious institutions never made their way into the state coffers, right? So, and to a large extent, this trick worked because some courts said that nobody had legal standing to bring the challenge to the laws. And other courts expressly agreed that the spending prohibitions didn't prevent the tax credit approach, right? But those legal advantages, first of all, they largely don't apply to ESA policies where the spending is more direct. But then they also became less important as the US Supreme Court began questioning the constitutionality of those provisions, those no aid clauses in the state constitutions. In fact, sometime I saw some people are asking Q&A questions about the upcoming Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue case. We expect in the next few weeks, the Supreme Court to hand down a decision in that case. The case concerns a tax credit policy that was passed in Montana. It was never implemented, to my knowledge, because the state Supreme Court in Montana enforced that state's no aid clause in its state constitution. And now the state of Montana is before the Supreme Court defending its state constitution and its Supreme Court decision against a challenge by voucher advocates that say essentially don't enforce this provision. Well, as you know, the current US Supreme Court is decidedly right-wing. And one element of that has been a hostility to restrictions on taxpayer funding of churches. So most observers expect the decision in the Espinoza case to limit the ability of states to enforce those no aid clauses, but we'll have to see. Okay, so given those very real and anticipated legal shifts, I think the current movement away from conventional vouchers toward tuition tax credit approaches and ESA approaches is driven much more by policy. So think again about the things we've talked about that make ESAs attractive to voucher advocates, right? You have, well, I remember I wrote a book about 12 years ago called Neo-Vouchers, right? And I got this pushback from voucher advocates about that name, about the name Neo-Vouchers. And it was, these aren't really vouchers, stop calling them that, right? And the idea that I think came out of public opinion polling, initiatives like the one I mentioned that was before Arizona voters in 2018, where vouchers are consistently voted down, focus groups, they all reveal that that once a policy is identified as a voucher policy, it becomes less attractive. Vouchers don't poll well. But if you have a proposal for a tuition or a tax credit scholarship or an education savings account, or now these education freedom scholarships, right? That to the extent that these are not recognized as vouchers, they have a rhetorical and therefore a political advantage over proposals that adopt conventional voucher policies. And then there's the regulation or deregulation issue that we've been discussing. That's also, I think, a political advantage. That ESA approaches are less regulated than conventional voucher approaches. The government is one more step removed from the spending of the taxpayer dollars, which means that there are fewer strings attached to that spending.
Thanks very much, Kevin and Luis. And thank you for touching on the Espinoza decision, Kevin. Of several audience members have written with questions about when that decision is expected, as you said, probably in the next few weeks. And wanted to know a little bit more about how the court might decide that. So we will certainly be keeping up with that at Public Funds Public Schools as well. And our amicus brief, our friend of the court brief that PFPS filed, is also posted on our website, on our litigation page, if you're interested in reading that. So we've received many wonderful questions while you two were giving answers to my questions. And I want to make sure that we get to as many of those as we can. I'm going to try to consolidate some that are on the same subjects and throw a few things out to you so that you can talk about some of these very important topics. So the first is, we've gotten a few questions about what are the effect on public education of diverting tax funds to private schools. And some of our audience members have given examples like Ohio, where the Ed Choice program is funded through a school district deduction. And the formula sometimes awards a school district less state aid than the amount of money extracted by the voucher, is one example given by our audience. So do one or both of you want to talk a little bit about the effects on public education of diverting tax funds in smaller programs, and then some of our audience have asked about as programs grow larger?
Want me to start, Luis?
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Okay.
Go.
Well, I think that the way you've asked that is really important, sort of the small versus the large. So part of the answer is it always depends, right? It depends on the way the state law is written. It depends, you mentioned the Ohio system versus other states that might not take that money out of the immediate public school budget. I mentioned the Nevada case where that was a core issue in the litigation. So that is an important part of the answer. It really depends on the way the law is written in terms of the short-term impact or the small scale impact. I think the more important question is the longer term or larger scale impact. Because if you scale up a system that removes money and children from the public school system, you will almost by definition be removing public support from the public school system. And so that long-term trend can become a very destructive cycle in terms of the financial and political support for the public school system. If you have, say, 50% of the population in an area that doesn't use the public schools, that 50% is unlikely to be supporting the public school. We do see this internationally and in some places in the US, where you have a disinvestment financially and politically from the public school system. And so that to me is the much larger concern in terms of a system like this. I think there are a lot of other objections that people raise and do raise, can raise and do raise, but I think that would be the biggest one. Luis, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I'm also going to focus on what I think many people might consider to be an intangible sort of effect that may not necessarily have to do with direct fiscal impact, even though some of the work that I've done in responding to a lot of the claims by proponents that vouchers or tuition tax credits will save taxpayers money because, for example, the claim that private school tuition is less or that the subsidy amount is less than tuition prices, that is very dependent on also the scale of the program over time and how many kids are actually taking this up. But often those sort of claims don't often take into consideration the negative effects on the economies of scale of operating schools, where kids who leave public schools aren't coming from one school, they're coming from a variety of schools, and that drop of enrollment has a profoundly negative impact when we talk about still having to keep up the physical plant, so to speak, of that school. But I want to speak about sort of the intangible about the broader issue of sort of social cohesion and democracy. And I think it's important to just sort of remind ourselves that and this is due to a little bit of the continuation of the conversation around accountability and so forth, is that by prohibiting state ed departments from engaging in due diligence oversight of private schools, vouchers, and tax credit programs and ESAs, threaten public authority and the ability of states to ensure a uniform education system that advances equity, social cohesion, and democratic citizenship, which is often a guaranteed part that is included in most state constitution education clauses. It's important to remember that U.S. citizens rely on public schools to teach students to participate in democratic processes, engage in public discourse, and respect divergent viewpoints. And vouchers and tax credits and ESAs for private school tuition may encourage families to separate themselves into school communities with competing social value systems. So that's these sort of subsidy programs contest the common school model and shift attention away from sort of these established public goals such as citizenship, training, and workforce preparation. And these are tenets that have been echoed for so long in Brown v. Board, where the court stated that education is important, quote, to our democratic society, and it is required in the performance of our most basic public responsibilities, and it is the very foundation of citizenship. So I think this intangible is very important to weigh in relation to the hard potential economic negative impacts that we often speak about.
Thank you both. And Luis, let me stick with you for our next question. Kevin has told us a bit about some of the financial aspects of vouchers, fraud, and things like that. One of our audience members asks if you could talk about the coordinated effort by national privatizers to push school choice and who benefits financially from these efforts.
Sure. There's been a very little research on this. I think ProPublica and a couple other venues have talked a little bit about this, about sort of these coordinated efforts that we see not just in education policy, but also in environmental law and a lot of other places. And most of these efforts are funded by groups like ALEC and others that have been promoting, and the Koch brothers as well. But the coordination is actually with regards to promoting, for example, new education tax credit programs or ESAs, and putting out language and having lobbyists communicate with legislators and trying to promote these programs. It's extremely transparent, and all it takes is a visit to the edchoice.org website, which does an amazing job as a clearinghouse of providing us with just a very quick click of a button. Every state, the actual text of every state education law around vouchers, tax credits, and other private choice programs. But there's a very consistent pattern that you see, for example, with tax credit laws. And it's a boilerplate, essentially. And these boilerplate types of legislation language that is shared across states, that is handed by lobbyists to legislators, is extremely apparent. And all it takes is a very novice understanding of basic discourse analysis, even to just go in and look at how this language is similar, where in some cases it's almost as if somebody just erased the name of the state in one education law and added the name of the new state where this might have been provided. So these are very coordinated efforts that are not that sophisticated, because it's really just sharing some of these basic structures of how these of the legalese, the language that is specific to how some of these laws actually come to be policies in many states.
Thank you. And I'll just add that PFPS is tracking that voucher legislation and proposals across the country with our bill tracker tool. So you can access that on our website as well. Look at what's been proposed in your state. Kevin, let me go back to you. As Luis told us before, some of the research on academic outcomes of different voucher programs. And I'm gonna read you a couple of questions about outcomes from our audience. One participant has said, I have noticed that advocates have shifted their focus from achievement outcomes to parent satisfaction and post-secondary attributes of students who attend private schools on vouchers. What do you think about this shift? And another audience member has asked, has there been a meta-analysis of voucher gains since 2009? And if not, why are there few studies on whether vouchers are improving the quality of education, and why aren't states commissioning these reviews?
Okay, jump in if I fail to answer some of that. To my knowledge, there has not been a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is a particular type of statistical analysis that takes the different effect sizes from different studies and brings them together depending on a variety of factors, including how many participants there are in the different studies. And that's sort of separate from a attempt to bring together all the research in one place and discuss it all together. To my knowledge, there has not been a meta-analysis of vouchers in recent years, which is particularly important because, as Luis said, there have been there's been a new wave of studies out of places like Louisiana and DC and Indiana that are showing negative results if you receive a voucher compared to the comparison group. In other words, if you didn't receive a similar group of people who didn't receive a voucher. So yeah, it would be good to do. I think part of that question was why not, or why have there not been more studies of outcomes? Part of the problem is we're discussing 3 different types. If you go back to the first slide that I put on my screen share. The only types of analyses of voucher policies that really have been studied in this way are conventional voucher approaches. And that's in part because they generate the data that you can actually use to do these analyses. Remember, we talked about ESAs, and some states, 3 out of 5, do require some normative test to be, some norm reference test to be taken by the students. But even then, the data aren't available, the analyses haven't been available. So you just have no way to do that sort of outcome analysis. So again, it's the feature, not a bug. This is intentionally hazy, right? Similar sorts of laws impede the ability to analyze what I call the neo-voucher, or the tuition tax credit approach. So we're really just looking at some studies of conventional voucher approaches. There was a first part of your question that I've forgotten already.
I think you've covered it. I think that a lot of our participants have wanted to know whether there have been these sort of meta studies or more definitive studies recently, and if not, where's the data and why not? It sounds like you're telling us that a lot of the data.
Yeah, I feel like I did miss something, but I apologize to whoever asked that.
Well, I apologize that we are not able to get to many of the great questions that have been posed by our audience. We could ask Louise and Kevin to answer these questions all day. Unfortunately, we're reaching the end of our hour, but I want to ask both of you if there are any other points or anything else that you want to say about ESAs or the kind of current proposals about vouchers. Or we asked you all the right questions.
I think we're good.
Well, I want to thank you both very much, Professor Kevin Wellner and Professor Luis Huerta, for coming on this second PFPS webinar, and also thank National Education Policy Center again for co-sponsoring this event with us. I want to remind everybody who tuned in, if you aren't already signed up on our list to receive our updates, go to pfps.org and sign up on the contact page. And we will be sending out information soon about the next webinar in our series. Thank you very much to everybody for participating today.
Thank you.